It was a Saturday afternoon when I found myself in need of a few supplies for a small home improvement project. The weather had turned unexpectedly chilly, clouds looming overhead as I pulled into the parking lot of the local hardware store. I was hoping to get in and out quickly, but as I stepped inside, I was greeted by the comforting smell of wood shavings and the metallic tang of tools. The store was sparsely populated, a few shoppers meandering down the aisles, lost in their own worlds. I grabbed a cart and headed toward the lumber section, scanning the shelves for the materials I needed. As I reached for a couple of boards, I noticed a man in the next aisle over. He was tall and gaunt, his clothes hanging loosely off his frame, and he was staring intently at a shelf filled with nails. At first, I thought little of it. He seemed harmless enough, but there was something about the way he stood, still and focused, that sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced away, dismissing the feeling as mere paranoia. After all, everyone has their quirks, and some people simply take longer to make decisions. As I continued shopping, I caught sight of him again, this time down the aisle where the power tools were displayed. He stood there, his back to me, seemingly oblivious to the bustle around him. I grabbed a circular saw and turned to leave, but something made me glance back once more. He was still there, still motionless, but I could sense a tension in his posture, as if he were waiting for something or someone. My instincts kicked in, and I felt a tug of anxiety. I tried to shake it off and focused on my list, but each time I turned a corner, there he was, a specter in the store, always just out of sight. It felt as if he was tracking my every move, a silent observer in this mundane space. The way he remained focused on his surroundings was unnerving. I couldn't help but feel that he was waiting for a moment to make his presence known. I moved to the plumbing section, hoping to shake off the odd feeling that had settled in my chest. I browsed through pipes and fittings, mentally cataloging what I needed. But the unease lingered, creeping back in as I caught another glimpse of him from the corner of my eye. This time he was closer, standing just outside the aisle, peering in, his eyes darting between me and the shelves. Panic flared in my stomach. I knew I was being irrational, that there was no reason to think he meant any harm. Yet I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to escape the oppressive sensation that enveloped me. I took a deep breath and decided to head toward the checkout, hoping to find solace in the safety of the cash register. As I made my way back, I could feel his gaze on me, a weight that seemed to press against my back. I quickened my pace, navigating through the aisles filled with tools and supplies, my heart racing as I neared the front of the store. The cheerful sounds of other customers chatting and the soft hum of machinery felt distant, swallowed by the growing tension around me. When I reached the checkout line, I glanced back one last time. To my relief, I didn't see him immediately. I thought perhaps I had imagined the whole thing, that my nerves had played tricks on me in the quiet of the store. I focused on my surroundings, feeling slightly more at ease. As I waited for my turn at the register, I noticed movement from the corner of my eye. My heart sank as I turned, and there he was again, just a few feet away. He had positioned himself near the entrance, but his eyes were fixed on me. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment, his presence a shadow lurking at the edge of my awareness. The checkout clerk began scanning my items, and I struggled to maintain my composure. I kept glancing at the man, who remained unmoving, a figure frozen in time. I felt trapped, caught between the safety of the register and the growing dread that accompanied his gaze. Once my items were bagged, I grabbed the handles of my cart tightly and forced myself to walk toward the exit. With every step, I expected him to follow, to close the distance between us. I could almost hear the echo of my heartbeat in my ears, drowning out the mundane sounds of the store. As I stepped outside, a gust of wind whipped through the parking lot, carrying with it the scent of rain. I felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. I dared to look back one more time, and my heart plummeted. He was standing just inside the store, watching me through the glass doors. His expression was unreadable, but the intensity of his gaze sent a shiver down my spine. I hurried to my car, fumbling with my keys as I struggled to unlock the door. The sky darkened, clouds rolling in thicker, mirroring the weight in my chest. I jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me, and locked it, as if the barrier would keep him away. I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart racing as I scanned the parking lot for any sign of him. He had stepped outside, and my breath caught in my throat as I watched him move, his figure oddly fluid and purposeful. It was as if he were searching for something, or someone. In a panic, I started the engine, my hands shaking as I backed out of the parking space. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, his gaze following my every move. I pulled away from the hardware store, my heart pounding as I drove, unable to look back for fear of what I might see. The familiar streets felt alien as I made my way home, the tension in my chest refusing to dissipate. I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see him behind me, still lurking in the shadows. Each time I turned a corner, I felt as though he might appear, a ghost from the hardware store haunting my every thought. When I finally reached home, I bolted inside, locking the door behind me. I leaned against the wall, trying to calm my racing heart. The familiar comforts of home surrounded me, but the unsettling encounter lingered in my mind. I felt exposed, as if he might appear at any moment, watching and waiting from the shadows of my own life. As the evening wore on, the storm rolled in, rain pounding against the windows, creating a soothing backdrop that contrasted sharply with my frayed nerves. I tried to distract myself with mundane tasks, but the image of that man remained imprinted in my mind, a reminder of the unexpected darkness that can lurk behind familiar facades. I sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, trying to watch television, but every creak of the house, every flash of lightning sent my heart racing. I'd never considered the hardware store to be a place of danger, yet the thought of that man's relentless gaze haunted me. The night dragged on, the storm intensifying outside. Each rumble of thunder echoed the tension that had built within me. I glanced at the clock, hoping the hours would pass quickly, but time felt suspended, each moment stretching into eternity. Finally, as the rain subsided and the storm began to wane, I decided to go to bed. I needed to escape the day's events, to find solace in sleep. But even as I lay there, the shadows in my room felt heavy, the walls closing in as I closed my eyes. Sleep came slowly, but the nightmares that followed were vivid and jarring. I dreamt of the hardware store, of that man watching me from the shadows, always just out of reach. Each time I tried to escape, he would be waiting, his gaze piercing through the darkness, a reminder of the unsettling reality I had encountered. When morning finally came, I awoke in a cold sweat, the remnants of the nightmare still clinging to me. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the dread that lingered from the night before. Yet, as I stepped into the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hardware store lurker was still out there, lurking just beyond my line of sight, a specter of unease that had transformed my once simple trip into a lasting nightmare. It was just another Saturday, the kind that called for leisurely strolls through the local park. After a long week of work, I was eager to enjoy the sunshine and the fresh air. The park was a familiar place, filled with the laughter of children and the chatter of people enjoying the weekend. I found a path that wound through trees and flower beds, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face as I walked. As I made my way down the path, I noticed a man sitting on a bench ahead. He was unremarkable at first glance, wearing a light jacket and jeans, with tousled hair that looked like it hadn't seen a comb in a while. He had a friendly smile that seemed to brighten his whole face, and I could see that he was watching the people around him, nodding and waving at anyone who passed by. I was caught off guard by his enthusiasm. In a world where people often hurried past one another, he stood out like a beacon of friendliness. When I got closer, he smiled even wider, lifting a hand in greeting. It felt strange, but I smiled back, thinking nothing of it. Perhaps he was just an overly cheerful person who wanted to spread some positivity. As I continued my walk, I could feel his gaze lingering on me. I brushed it off, attributing it to my own self-consciousness. The park was crowded, and it was easy to get lost in thought, but there was something unsettling about how he watched me. I could see him in my peripheral vision, his eyes tracking my every movement as I strolled by. After a few minutes, I decided to find a bench and take a break, hoping to enjoy my surroundings in peace. I sat down, taking a moment to breathe and soak in the sun. But soon enough, I felt the familiar presence of someone nearby. I looked up, and there he was, the overly friendly man from the bench. He had moved closer, standing just a few feet away, still smiling that same bright smile. I felt a wave of discomfort wash over me. There was something about the intensity of his gaze that made me uneasy, but I didn't want to appear rude. I forced a polite smile, trying to dismiss the creeping feeling of dread that gnawed at the back of my mind. He started to tell me about the various sights in the park, the flowers, the ducks in the pond, the children playing on the swings. His enthusiasm was infectious at first, and I found myself nodding along. But As he continued, I noticed that his smile never faded. It was as if he was trying too hard to maintain a facade of friendliness, and the longer I listened, the more it felt like a performance rather than genuine conversation. Time passed, and I started to feel trapped. The park was full of people, yet I felt completely isolated in that moment. The more he talked, the less I wanted to engage. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me more than he was sharing anything about himself. Every gesture he made seemed to carry an underlying intensity, like he was dissecting my reactions for some hidden purpose. Finally, I managed to excuse myself, standing up and feigning a desire to explore more of the park. His smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before returning, but I could see something shift behind his eyes. I took a few steps away, hoping to distance myself from the situation, but I could feel him following me, still smiling, still too close for comfort. I walked faster, trying to shake the sensation of being pursued. I ducked around trees and benches, glancing back periodically to confirm he was still there. He seemed unbothered by my attempts to evade him, his gait steady and unwavering. It was as if he had all the time in the world, content to keep following me through the park. As I navigated the winding paths, I grew increasingly anxious. I could hear laughter and voices in the distance, but they felt muted and far away. The familiar surroundings had turned into a maze, and my heart raced as I realized that I was trapped in this bizarre interaction. The friendly demeanor that had once seemed innocent now felt insidious. In an attempt to lose him, I darted down a narrow path that led deeper into the park. The trees grew denser, casting long shadows that swallowed the sunlight. The cheerful atmosphere faded into something darker, more suffocating. I could still hear his footsteps, and my pulse quickened with each step I took. Just when I thought I had managed to evade him, I glanced over my shoulder and saw him standing at the end of the path, still smiling, his hands casually tucked in his pockets. He looked entirely unbothered by my sudden change in pace, as if this was just a game to him. Panic surged within me, and I turned to run, my feet pounding against the ground. I cut through the trees, desperate to find my way back to the main area of the park. The laughter of children and the chatter of families became my lifeline, urging me to escape the suffocating presence behind me. I could feel my lungs burning as I sprinted, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The trees finally gave way to an open area, and I stumbled into the sunlight, my heart racing. I darted toward a group of people, blending into the crowd, desperate for the comfort of safety in numbers. I glanced back, hoping against hope that he had lost sight of me. He was nowhere to be seen. I took a moment to catch my breath, my pulse gradually returning to normal as I stood among other parkgoers. It felt like a narrow escape, and for a moment I thought I could finally relax. But as I looked around, I realized something unsettling. He could be anywhere. I felt the weight of eyes on me again, scanning the faces around me for that friendly smile, that too-perfect demeanor. I was surrounded by people, yet the dread lingered like a shadow at the edge of my consciousness. After a few minutes of lingering in the crowd, I decided it was best to leave the park. I made my way to the exit, the laughter and light fading behind me as I stepped onto the sidewalk. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows on the pavement. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my stomach. As I walked home, I couldn't help but feel that this encounter wasn't over. The overly friendly man had left an indelible mark on my mind, a reminder of how quickly a seemingly innocent moment could turn into something more sinister. I hurried home, glancing over my shoulder more than once, convinced that he might appear from the shadows at any moment, still smiling, still watching. The world outside felt different, a place where even the friendliest faces could conceal something darker beneath the surface. I had just stepped off the train after a long day at work, my mind still buzzing with thoughts of deadlines and meetings. The station was as crowded as ever, the usual chaos of people rushing to catch their trains or meet someone. I navigated through the throng, my eyes on my phone, trying to find directions to my favorite cafe, which I planned to visit for a much-needed coffee. As I walked, I noticed him out of the corner of my eye. He was standing by a pillar near the escalator, dressed sharply in a dark suit. He held a briefcase that looked expensive, with polished edges, and a leather that glimmered under the harsh fluorescent lights of the station. Everything about him was neatly put together, from his crisp white shirt to his perfectly knotted tie. At first I thought nothing of it. He blended in with the crowd, but something about the way he stood there caught my attention. He didn't seem to be in a hurry like the others. Instead, he was watching the crowd pass by, scanning faces with an intensity that felt out of place in the bustling atmosphere. I tried to ignore him, dismissing the odd sensation that accompanied his gaze. After all, people often looked at others in busy places. Perhaps he was waiting for someone. I continued on my way, but I felt an inexplicable pull to glance back at him. He was still standing there, still watching. It felt unsettling, like he was waiting for a moment, a specific person to arrive. I hurried away, shoving my phone into my pocket and trying to focus on the bustling crowd ahead of me. Yet the sensation lingered, like a whisper in the back of my mind. I found the cafe, the familiar aroma of freshly brewed coffee enveloping me as I stepped inside. I ordered my drink and settled into a corner booth, trying to shake off the lingering discomfort. I watched the world pass by through the large windows, the sun beginning to set and casting long shadows across the pavement. But the moment I took a sip of my coffee, I caught a glimpse of him again through the window. He stood at the edge of the cafe watching the people inside. The warm glow of the cafe contrasted sharply with the coldness of his demeanor. It was as if he had materialized from the shadows outside, and now he was searching for something or someone inside. My stomach sank as I realized that he wasn't just a passerby. He was still fixated on the entrance, scanning every person who entered the cafe. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow linked to me, even if I didn't know how. My heart raced, the coffee suddenly too bitter in my mouth. I moved to a different seat, trying to keep my distance from the window, but I couldn't help stealing glances. I noticed that he had stepped closer to the door now, still watching, still waiting. The briefcase remained clutched tightly in his hand as if it were a lifeline or a weapon. I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to escape the tension that had built inside me. After a few moments of indecision, I decided it was best to go. I paid for my drink and walked toward the exit, keeping my head down. As I stepped outside, I forced myself to keep moving, blending into the crowd around me. But I could feel his presence, a weight pressing against my back. I didn't dare look behind me, afraid of what I might see. I walked quickly, my pace quickening as I turned down a side street. I could hear the echo of footsteps behind me, steady and measured. But every time I glanced back, no one was there. The streetlights flickered on, and the shadows stretched out long and thin as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The feeling of being watched intensified, each step echoing in my mind, urging me to look back. I fought against the urge, convincing myself that it was all in my head. Yet, the longer I walked, the more convinced I became that he was still following me, the man in the sharp suit and the briefcase. I quickened my pace, turning down another street, trying to lose him. But it felt like I was in a maze, the buildings closing in around me. My heart raced as I scanned the area for a place to hide or a way to lose him. I saw a small alleyway and ducked into it, hoping to evade the strange man. The alley was narrow and dimly lit, trash cans lined against the walls, and the smell of decay lingered in the air. I pressed myself against the cold brick, trying to quiet my breathing. I could hear the distant sounds of the city, the rumble of traffic, and the murmur of voices. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, straining to listen for any sign of him. Moments stretched into what felt like hours. Then, I heard it, a faint sound of footsteps, slow and methodical, echoing against the pavement. My breath caught in my throat. I held perfectly still, hoping that he would pass by, that he wouldn't think to look into the alley. The footsteps stopped, just outside the entrance. I dared to peek around the corner, my pulse racing as I glanced back toward the street. The man was standing there, just outside the alley, scanning the area with that same unsettling intensity. He was closer than I'd ever been aware of, the briefcase still gripped tightly in his hand. He took a step forward, then another, pausing as if he could sense my presence, as if he knew I was just out of sight. I quickly pulled back, pressing myself deeper into the shadows, praying he wouldn't look my way. The seconds felt like an eternity as I waited, every instinct screaming for me to run. But then, without warning, he turned away, walking back down the street, as if he had lost interest, the briefcase swinging gently at his side. I stayed hidden for a while longer, breathless and trembling, convinced that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. When I finally felt safe enough to leave the alley, I crept out cautiously, scanning the area for any sign of him. The street appeared empty now, the sun having set completely, leaving the city cloaked in darkness. I hesitated, unsure of where to go next, but I knew I couldn't stay in that neighborhood any longer. I moved quickly, merging with the crowds once again, but the sense of unease lingered. Every shadow felt like a reminder of the man who had watched me, who had followed me. I couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was just the beginning, that he would somehow find me again. The city felt more threatening as I walked, every passerby a potential threat. I finally reached a bus station, a place filled with the familiar sounds of people talking, the scent of food vendors wafting through the air. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I approached the ticket counter, ready to put as much distance between myself and that man as possible. I bought a ticket for the next bus, my fingers trembling as I counted out the cash. As I waited, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see him lurking nearby, but the bus station was crowded, filled with strangers. I forced myself to focus on the bright lights and the chatter around me, trying to drown out the memories of the last few hours. When the bus finally arrived, I stepped aboard, finding a seat near the back. I settled in, trying to breathe normally again, but the moment I felt safe, the image of the man with the briefcase returned to haunt me. I wondered who he was, why he had been watching me, and what he wanted. I could only hope that I had left him behind for good. As the bus pulled away from the station and out into the night, I felt the familiar tension begin to ease. The lights of the city faded into the distance, and I told myself that I could finally relax, that I was safe. But deep down, a nagging fear remained, that somewhere out there, in the shadows, he was still watching, waiting for his moment to strike. I'd been on the road for hours, and by the time I found the small roadside motel, I was too exhausted to care about its appearance. It wasn't a place you'd choose unless you had no other options. Peeling paint on the walls, a flickering neon vacancy sign, and an empty parking lot. The kind of place that looked forgotten, like it existed in some dead zone off the highway. But I was too tired to keep driving, so I pulled in and checked myself into one of the rooms. The room was as bare as I expected, sparse furniture, stained carpet, and a bed that creaked when I sat on it. There was a window that looked out onto the parking lot, and a thin, yellowed curtain hanging over it. The only light came from the buzzing fluorescent fixture overhead. It wasn't much, but it was quiet. I dropped my bags by the bed, planning to sleep for a few hours before heading out again in the morning. The only other car in the lot had been a beat-up old sedan, parked a few spots down from mine. I didn't think much of it at first. I assumed it belonged to the motel's owner or maybe another traveler passing through. But as I was settling in, I noticed something odd through the thin walls of the room. There was a faint sound, a dull, rhythmic tapping like someone knocking on a door, but slower, more deliberate. It was coming from the room next to mine, the one closest to the lot. The motel was nearly empty, so the sound stood out against the quiet. At first, I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to normal noises you hear in places like this. Pipes, creaky floors, that sort of thing. But the tapping continued, steady and unchanging, like someone was doing it on purpose. It went on for so long that it started to bother me. I sat on the bed, listening to it, trying to figure out what could be causing it. It wasn't loud enough to be alarming, but it was persistent, like it had some sort of rhythm to it. I considered going outside to see if I could figure out who was making the noise, but the longer I sat there, the more uneasy I felt. After what seemed like hours, the tapping stopped. The sudden silence should have been a relief, but instead it left me feeling on edge, like something had shifted. The quiet that followed was heavier, more oppressive. I tried to push the thought out of my mind, convincing myself that I was just overtired from the long drive. It was late, and all I wanted was to get some sleep before I had to hit the road again in the morning. But just as I was starting to relax, I heard something else. This time it was a low creaking, the sound of a door opening slowly. I froze, listening. The door next to mine. I heard it shut again, soft but definite, followed by the faintest footsteps outside. I glanced at the window. The curtain was closed, but I could see a faint shadow pass by outside, blocking out the light from the parking lot for just a moment. The shadow paused, lingering, as if whoever was out there was standing right in front of my door. My pulse quickened. I stared at the window, barely breathing, waiting to see if the shadow would move. But it didn't. It just stayed there, unmoving, for what felt like an eternity. I couldn't hear any more footsteps, just the low hum of the fluorescent light and the occasional creak of the old building settling. But I knew someone was out there, standing right in front of my room. The door to my room was thin, and there was no chain lock, just the deadbolt. I stayed where I was, listening, my eyes fixed on the curtain. The minutes stretched on, and eventually, the shadow moved away, disappearing into the night. I exhaled, not realizing I'd been holding my breath, but the tension didn't leave me. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept thinking about the footsteps and the shadow outside the door, wondering if whoever it was would come back. The tapping noise from earlier replayed in my head, growing more sinister the more I thought about it. Who had been in the room next to mine? What were they doing up so late, tapping on the wall like that? The rest of the night passed slowly. I stayed in bed, wide awake, straining to hear any other sounds, but none came. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off, because I woke to pale morning light streaming in through the curtain. I felt a wave of relief, eager to leave the motel behind. I packed up my things quickly, trying not to linger any longer than necessary. I glanced at the door to the room next to mine as I left, half expecting to see the stranger standing there. But the door was closed, and the beat-up sedan was still in the parking lot. It looked like it hadn't moved all night. As I pulled out of the lot, I passed the office. The clerk wasn't there, just a sign on the door saying the manager would return later. I hesitated, part of me wanting to mention the strange tapping and the shadow, but in the daylight it felt silly. Just my imagination playing tricks on me after too many hours on the road, I told myself. But as I merged back onto the highway, something nagged at me. The image of the shadow outside my door stayed with me, a vague sense of unease that wouldn't shake. I glanced in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that beat-up sedan following me, but the road behind was empty. Still, I couldn't help but wonder about the person in the room next to mine. Had they just been a harmless traveler like me? Or was there something else going on? The thought lingered as I drove, the memory of that tapping sound echoing in my mind long after I'd left the motel far behind. It was one of those long stretches of highway where the scenery never changes. Just the same barren fields and open road for miles. I'd been driving for hours, the hum of the engine the only sound breaking the monotony. When I spotted the gas station sign up ahead, it felt like a small relief, even if the place looked worn down from years of neglect. The flickering neon sign and rusted gas pumps were the only indication that it was still operational. There were no other cars around, just me and the open lot under the dim light of the station canopy. I pulled up to the pump, got out, and stretched my legs. The place had an eerie stillness to it. There was no sound except for the faint buzz of the station's old fluorescent lights overhead. The air smelled faintly of gasoline, and the wind kicked up little eddies of dust around my feet. I glanced around, taking in the chipped paint on the building, the cracked windows. There wasn't a soul in sight. As I started to pump gas, I noticed him. He was standing by the entrance of the convenience store, just barely visible under the shadows cast by the station's overhang. He hadn't been there when I pulled in. I was sure of it. His clothes were plain, jeans, a faded jacket, and a baseball cap that hid his face in shadow. He was leaning slightly against the wall, watching. I couldn't tell how long he'd been standing there, but the realization that I hadn't noticed him before made me uneasy. There was something unsettling about his presence, but it wasn't immediate danger I felt. It was more like an itch in the back of my mind, a sense that he was out of place, like he didn't belong there. He wasn't doing anything, just standing, watching as I pumped gas, but his stillness held an intensity I couldn't ignore. I kept my eyes forward, pretending not to see him, but I could feel his gaze. It was hard to tell if he was looking directly at me or just in my general direction, but either way it made my skin crawl. The pump clicked, signaling that my tank was full. I replaced the nozzle and quickly moved to get back in my car, wanting to leave as soon as possible. As I opened the door, I glanced up at the store again. He was still there, but now he had moved closer to the door, standing just outside it now, a step or two closer than before. I paused for a split second, unsure whether I should acknowledge him, but something about the way he seemed to drift closer without making any obvious movement made me decide against it. I got in the car and locked the doors immediately, my heart racing, even though nothing had technically happened. I sat there for a moment, telling myself I was overreacting. It was just some guy, probably another traveler stopping for a break. Maybe he was waiting for someone, or maybe he worked there and was on a smoke break. There were 100 logical reasons for him to be there, I told myself. But then as I turned the ignition and the car's engine roared to life, I looked back at the store. The man was no longer by the door. He had stepped out into the lot, standing near the pumps now, closer than he had been before. He wasn't looking directly at me anymore. His head was angled downward slightly, as though he was deep in thought. but the proximity was unnerving. There was nothing between us now except the stretch of concrete, and the space felt too narrow. I shifted into gear, feeling a surge of urgency as I pulled out of the station. I didn't look back, trying to focus on the road ahead, but my thoughts kept circling around the strange encounter. The highway stretched out in front of me, empty and endless. I kept telling myself that the man was just a harmless stranger, someone I had no reason to fear. But as the miles ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about him had been off. The road wound through more open countryside, the sky above darkening as night fully settled in. There were no other cars around, just the long stretch of blacktop and the faint glow of my headlights slicing through the darkness. It should have been comforting, that sense of isolation, but instead it felt oppressive. The further I drove, the more I found myself checking the rearview mirror. At first it was just a paranoid habit, a nervous glance every few minutes to reassure myself that the road behind me was still empty. But then, something caught my eye. A faint pair of headlights in the distance, far behind me. I watched them for a moment, telling myself it was nothing. Just another car. Someone traveling the same lonely stretch of highway. But as I continued driving, those headlights seemed to stay with me, maintaining the same distance. My grip on the steering wheel tightened. I told myself not to overthink it, that it was probably a coincidence. The highway wasn't exactly crowded, but it wasn't unheard of for another driver to be headed in the same direction. I tried to keep my eyes on the road ahead, but every few minutes, I found myself glancing in the rearview mirror again. The lights were still there. A few more miles passed, and the lights hadn't changed their position. I increased my speed slightly, wanting to create more distance, but the headlights seemed to match my pace. They weren't getting closer, but they weren't fading either. The same steady distance, like whoever was driving back there was perfectly content to stay just behind me. I started to feel a creeping sense of dread, wondering if it was the man from the gas station. I had no way of knowing for sure, but the thought lodged itself in my mind. What if he had followed me? The coincidence of the timing seemed too perfect, too deliberate. The more I thought about it, the more anxious I became. I pressed harder on the gas, the engine humming louder as I picked up speed. The headlights behind me remained constant. The highway stretched on, a straight shot through the countryside, and there were no exits in sight, no turns I could take to shake whoever was behind me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw a sign for a rest stop a few miles ahead. It wasn't much, just a small pull-off area with a few parking spots and some vending machines, but it was a chance to pull over and see if the car behind me would pass. I decided to take it. I pulled into the rest stop, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. The headlights behind me slowed as well. But then, just before reaching the exit, the car kept going, speeding past on the highway without stopping. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, my hands trembling slightly as I parked. I watched the taillights disappear into the distance, feeling a strange mix of relief and lingering fear. I sat there for a few minutes, letting my heart rate settle, telling myself that it was just another traveler, nothing more. But the feeling that I'd narrowly avoided something stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. The road was still, the rest stop empty, and I found myself unwilling to stay there any longer than I had to. I got back onto the highway, but the unease didn't leave. Even as I drove further into the night, the image of the man at the gas station stayed with me. His stillness, the way he had seemed to drift closer each time I looked, the headlights that had followed me for miles. It all felt connected, though I couldn't explain how. I drove on, putting more and more miles between me and that gas station, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't really left anything behind, and that somewhere out on that empty road, the man was still watching. I had a habit of taking evening walks to clear my mind, and one of my usual routes brought me past a small old cemetery on the outskirts of town. It was a quiet, unassuming place, surrounded by a low stone wall and dotted with weathered headstones that leaned slightly as if time had worn them down. It was the kind of spot that most people didn't pay much attention to, especially at night, when the streetlights barely reached beyond the entrance. That particular evening, I'd set out later than usual. The sky was darkening as I turned down the narrow street that bordered the cemetery. I glanced over at it as I walked by, more out of habit than anything else, expecting to see nothing but the familiar rows of faded gravestones and a few scraggly trees. But as I looked closer, I noticed something unusual, a lone figure standing among the headstones. It caught me off guard. The cemetery was typically deserted, especially this late. The figure was still, just barely visible in the growing darkness. From what I could make out, they were standing in the older part of the graveyard, near the back where the stones were more weathered and often covered in ivy. They looked to be an adult, dressed in dark clothing that blended into the shadows around them. I paused for a moment, watching, unsure if I should be concerned. There was something off about the way they stood, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It wasn't just that they were in a cemetery at night. There was an intensity to the stillness that seemed almost unnatural, like they weren't just lingering but waiting for something specific. I told myself it was none of my business and started to walk away, but as I turned, a flicker of curiosity made me look back. The figure hadn't moved. They were still facing the same direction, seemingly fixated on something among the graves. I couldn't see their face clearly from where I stood, but the longer I watched, the more I felt that their presence didn't belong there, like they were intruding on something private. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the unease that had crept over me. The path I took led me around the back of the cemetery, where a small iron gate opened onto a quiet side street. As I passed by, I found myself glancing through the bars, searching for another glimpse of the stranger. They were still there, standing in the exact same spot. A chill ran down my spine, but I kept walking, forcing myself not to look back again. It was just a stranger, I reasoned. Maybe a mourner who had lost track of time or someone visiting a loved one's grave. But something about the way they stood there, so still, made me doubt that explanation. I took a different route home that night, trying to put the incident out of my mind. But the image of that lone figure standing among the headstones lingered, cropping up in my thoughts when I least expected it. The next few days passed uneventfully, and I convinced myself that I'd made too much of it, that it was just a harmless encounter with someone paying their respects. A week later, I found myself walking the same route again, the evening sky already dimming as I approached the cemetery. I hesitated as I neared the gate, the memory of the figure still fresh in my mind. Against my better judgment, I glanced inside. They were there again, standing in the same spot. The figure looked exactly as they had before, dressed in dark clothing, face hidden in the shadows, motionless among the gravestones. My heart began to race as I stared. It was impossible. A whole week had passed, yet they were standing there as if no time had gone by at all. I stood there, rooted to the spot, trying to process what I was seeing. There was no logical reason for someone to be in the same spot night after night without moving. I told myself it had to be a trick of my memory, that I was jumping to conclusions. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The scene was exactly as I remembered it. The same headstone, the same patch of ground, even their posture was identical. I forced myself to keep walking, trying not to look again, but the image stayed burned in my mind. As I rounded the corner and took the side street past the back gate, I couldn't help it. I glanced through the bars, hoping to see an empty graveyard, but the figure was still there, standing in that same spot, facing away from me. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadowy figure standing among the gravestones, unchanging, waiting. The thought of it gnawed at me, the impossibility of it all. I found myself replaying every detail in my mind, trying to convince myself that there was a rational explanation. I avoided that route for a while after that, taking different paths and steering clear of the cemetery. But curiosity is a difficult thing to suppress, and part of me needed to know if the figure would still be there. After a couple of weeks, I gave in and walked past again, feeling a strange mix of fear and anticipation as I neared the gate. The cemetery was empty. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly overshadowed by doubt. Had I imagined it? Had it just been a coincidence, someone visiting at the same time on those nights? I almost convinced myself that I had overreacted, that I'd let my imagination get the better of me. But just as I was about to move on, I noticed something. Near the back of the cemetery, where the figure had stood, there was a fresh mound of dirt, a small unmarked grave. It hadn't been there the last time I'd looked. A chill spread through me as I stared at it. I didn't know why it unsettled me so much, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the grave was connected to the figure somehow. Maybe it was just my mind trying to piece together an explanation, but the presence of that freshly turned earth felt like an answer I didn't want to understand. I left quickly, my thoughts racing. I haven't walked past that cemetery since. Even now, the sight of it makes me uneasy, and I avoid that side of town whenever I can. But sometimes on nights when the streets are empty and the sky is dark, I find myself thinking about that figure, standing so still among the gravestones. I can't help but wonder what would happen if I looked again, if they would be there, waiting, in that same spot, unchanged. And I wonder if somehow they had been waiting for me all along. It had been a long day, one of those where the hours drag on and you find yourself craving any excuse to escape. The grocery store run wasn't planned, just an impulsive decision to delay going home. By the time I pulled into the parking lot, the sun was already sinking, casting long shadows across the asphalt. There weren't many cars left, just a few scattered here and there. It was quiet, with the distant hum of traffic and the occasional flicker of the overhead lights. As I parked near the back of the lot, I noticed the dog almost immediately. It stood near the edge of the lot where the concrete met a scraggly patch of grass. Its fur was matted, a dirty brown that blended into the evening gloom, and it stood unnervingly still, staring directly at me. I wasn't sure where it had come from. There were no houses nearby, and the lot itself was bordered by tall, chain-link fencing. It looked like a stray, but there was something about it that made me hesitate. I watched it for a moment, half expecting it to wander off, but it didn't move. It just stood there, watching me as though it was waiting for something. Its body was tense, not like a dog eager for food or attention, but as if it was anticipating something more. I forced myself to look away, grabbing my shopping list from the passenger seat and stepping out of the car. The soft sound of my shoes hitting the asphalt echoed faintly in the empty space. As I walked toward the entrance, I glanced over my shoulder, but the dog hadn't moved. Its gaze followed me, unwavering. It made me uncomfortable, but I told myself it was just a stray, probably looking for food, maybe confused. I hurried into the store, eager to put the unsettling encounter behind me. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an almost sterile glow over the aisles. I moved quickly, gathering the few items I needed and trying not to think too much about the dog outside. But the image of it standing so still, staring, lingered in the back of my mind. There was something unnatural about the way it watched me, something that made my skin crawl the longer I thought about it. After a few minutes, I found myself at the checkout, and as I stood in line, I glanced out through the large glass windows that overlooked the parking lot. The dog was gone. Relief washed over me for a moment, but it was quickly replaced by an uneasy feeling. Where had it gone? Had it moved further into the shadows, or was it still out there, hidden now? I shook off the thought, paid for my groceries, and headed back outside. The cool evening air hit me as I stepped through the sliding doors, and the parking lot felt eerily still. The distant hum of traffic had faded, leaving only the quiet buzz of the overhead lights. I scanned the lot, searching for any sign of the dog, but it was nowhere to be seen. The further I walked toward my car, the more aware I became of how alone I was. The other cars in the lot seemed abandoned, their owners long gone. The dog's absence felt strange, like its presence had been a warning I hadn't fully understood. I reached my car and began loading the groceries into the trunk, but that creeping sense of unease was still there, prickling at the back of my neck. I couldn't help it. I glanced around again, searching the shadows near the edges of the lot. For a moment, everything was still. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. The dog was back, standing on the far side of the lot, closer now than before. It wasn't running, wasn't even walking, it was just standing there, staring at me again. Its eyes locked onto mine, and the unease I'd felt earlier came rushing back. This time there was no mistaking it. Something wasn't right about this dog. Its body language wasn't familiar. There was none of the nervous energy of a stray, none of the curiosity or need. Instead, it was deliberate, focused, as though its entire purpose was to watch me. I finished loading my groceries, my movements quick and clumsy, trying to get into the car as fast as I could. I didn't want to make it obvious that I was scared, but every instinct in my body was telling me to leave. I opened the driver's side door and slid inside, immediately locking the doors behind me. I glanced through the windshield, my heart pounding in my chest. The dog had moved closer again. It was now standing directly in the center of the lot, perfectly still, its eyes locked on mine through the glass. The distance between us felt shorter than it should have been, as though the dog had closed the gap in the seconds it took me to get into the car. I started the engine, but I didn't pull out right away. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my eyes fixed on the dog. It stood motionless, staring, almost as if it was waiting for me to make the first move. The tension in the air was thick, and despite the glass and metal between us, I felt exposed, like the dog was somehow closer than it appeared. As I slowly backed out of the parking space, the dog remained rooted in place, its eyes never leaving mine. It didn't flinch, didn't turn away, just watched as I began to drive. I pulled onto the main road, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it following me. But the lot behind me was empty, the dog gone once again. I drove in silence, my mind racing with the strangeness of the encounter. Something about that dog had been wrong, not just in its behavior, but in the way it made me feel. Like I had been singled out, watched for a reason I couldn't understand. For the next few days, the memory of the dog stayed with me. Every time I went out, I found myself scanning parking lots, watching the edges of the road, expecting to see it again. But I never did. It was gone just as mysteriously as it had appeared. And yet, even now, when I pull into an empty lot at night, I can't help but look around, half waiting for that still, silent figure to reappear, watching me from the shadows. I had been driving for hours, cutting through the vast, empty countryside with nothing but miles of fields stretching in every direction. The landscape was repetitive, endless rows of crops swaying under the weight of the evening breeze, dotted with the occasional farmhouse in the distance. The road was narrow and isolated, a single strip of asphalt that seemed to cut straight through the heart of nowhere. As I drove, the day slowly dimmed into twilight, and soon, the only light came from the dim glow of my headlights. It was peaceful at first, almost comforting, the solitude of the road matching the quiet of the empty fields. But the further I drove, the more unsettling the silence became. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like you weren't supposed to be there, like something was out of place, though you couldn't quite tell what. I was getting close to my destination, or at least I thought I was, when something caught my eye. A figure standing in one of the fields just off the road. At first, I thought I was imagining it. After hours of driving, fatigue was settling in, and my eyes had started playing tricks on me. But as I passed, I could see him clearly, standing alone among the crops, far from any farmhouse or building. He was facing the road, just standing there, unmoving, watching as I drove past. There was nothing remarkable about him at first glance. He wore a simple, weathered coat and jeans, typical for someone working out in the fields. But it was the way he was positioned, like he had been waiting, that made my stomach twist. He wasn't working the land, wasn't tending to anything. He was just there, alone, in the middle of the field, watching. I slowed the car, unsure of what I was seeing. It felt wrong seeing someone out there so late, so far from any real sign of life. The crops were tall, thick rows of corn and grain, stretching as far as I could see, making it difficult to understand why anyone would be standing out there alone. He seemed to blend into the landscape, his figure almost disappearing among the stalks, like he belonged there in a way that made me uneasy. As I passed him, I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been watching me specifically. The road was empty, not another car in sight, and the more I thought about it, the stranger it felt. Why was he standing there at all? There was no sign of equipment, no tools, no reason for him to be lingering in the middle of an empty field. It was as if he had been placed there, intentionally, for the sole purpose of being seen. I pressed on the gas, eager to put distance between myself and the figure. But as I drove further, I couldn't stop thinking about him. The fields blurred by, but the memory of his presence lingered in my mind, gnawing at me with each passing mile. I tried to focus on the road, but every time I blinked, I could picture him standing there, watching, as though he was still with me somehow, even though I had left him behind. The road curved ahead, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement in the distance. My heart skipped, thinking it might be another car or maybe a deer, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't an animal at all. It was the same figure standing in a different field, a little further down the road. I couldn't explain it. I hadn't passed any turnoffs or intersecting roads, nothing that would suggest he had moved ahead of me. Yet, there he was, standing in the same motionless pose, facing the road just like before. I slowed again, my eyes scanning the figure, looking for some explanation. But it was him. The same coat, the same jeans, the same eerie stillness that made my skin prickle. It felt impossible, like some strange glitch in reality, but there he was, unmistakably the same man. My grip on the wheel tightened as I drove past, refusing to look directly at him this time. I sped up, my heart pounding now, trying to convince myself that it was a coincidence, that I was overthinking it. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The roads were too empty, the landscape too vast for him to just appear like that. I drove faster, the unease building in my chest with every mile. But the road kept stretching on, and soon, I found myself approaching another stretch of empty fields. My eyes scanned the horizon anxiously, dreading what I might see. And then, as if on cue, I spotted him again. The same figure in a different field, standing closer to the road this time. It was undeniable now. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me, no explanation for how he was there again. It felt deliberate, like he was following me in some way I couldn't understand. Every time I thought I had left him behind, he was there, waiting, as though he knew exactly where I was headed. My breath quickened as I passed him again, resisting the urge to stop and confront him, but the fear that had settled in my gut kept me moving. I didn't want to know why he was there or how he kept appearing. All I wanted was to get away, to put as much distance between us as possible. The road seemed endless, and no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that he would appear again. And he did. Each time he was a little closer to the road, a little closer to me. His face remained expressionless, his posture unchanged, but there was something deeply unsettling about the way he kept reappearing, like he was a part of the landscape itself, tied to the fields in a way that defied reason. By the time I reached my destination, my hands were trembling on the wheel. I pulled into a gas station, the lights blindingly bright after so many miles of darkness. As I got out of the car, I glanced around, half expecting to see him standing nearby, but he was gone, left behind on the long, empty stretch of road. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't finished with me yet. The image of him standing in those fields stayed with me, haunting my thoughts. Even now, when I drive through open country, I find myself scanning the horizon, waiting for him to appear again, always watching, always waiting. The stretch of highway I was driving on seemed endless, nothing but dark fields and the occasional flicker of light from some distant farmhouse. I hadn't seen another car for miles, and the night felt heavier the longer I drove. My gas gauge was dangerously close to empty, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen a station. So when the neon glow of a gas station appeared in the distance, it was a relief, even though it looked like it had been forgotten by time. I pulled in, parking under the only working light. The place felt deserted, but the old pumps were functional, so I filled up. The store itself had flickering signs advertising things no one would buy anymore, but I decided to head inside anyway to grab a drink and stretch my legs. As soon as I stepped in, the smell hit me, a mix of old coffee, dust, and something faintly chemical. The shelves were sparse, filled with outdated snacks and random mismatched items. The single employee at the counter didn't even look up as I walked in, and the silence was thick, almost tangible. The place gave off a weird vibe, but I shrugged it off. It was just one of those run-down stops in the middle of nowhere. I grabbed a drink and paid without incident, eager to get back on the road. As I turned to leave, I noticed someone had entered the store behind me. I hadn't heard the door open, but there he was, standing a few feet away in line, as if he had just appeared. He was a little older than me, maybe in his late 30s, with unremarkable features. His clothes were clean but worn in a way that suggested he had been traveling for a while, too. He wasn't carrying anything, no bag or drink, just standing there. Something about his presence felt too deliberate, like he was there for a reason that had nothing to do with the store. I tried not to think too much about it and turned toward the door, but as I walked out, I could feel his eyes on me, tracking my every move. I brushed it off as paranoia, road fatigue playing tricks on me. I got back to my car and was about to start the engine when, out of nowhere, the man appeared next to my window. I hadn't heard his footsteps, hadn't noticed him leave the store, but there he was, close enough that I could see the faint lines on his face. I froze for a moment, unsure of what he wanted. His expression was calm, neutral, but his proximity made me uneasy. He didn't knock on the window or make any gesture for me to roll it down. Instead, he stood there, staring at me through the glass. Something in the way he looked at me felt invasive, as though he knew more about me than he should. The silence between us stretched out, and the longer it went on, the more uncomfortable I became. Finally, he raised his hand, palm open. It took me a second to register what he was doing. offering a handshake. There was no reason for it, no context. I hadn't spoken to him, hadn't even acknowledged him beyond that brief glance inside the store. Yet here he was, insisting on this strange interaction. My instinct was to drive away, but my curiosity got the better of me. I rolled down the window just enough to extend my hand. His grip was firm, but what struck me was how cold his skin felt. It wasn't the kind of cold you'd expect from someone standing outside on a cool night. It was deeper, more unnatural, like the warmth had been drained from him entirely. His eyes met mine as our hands connected, and in that brief moment, everything felt wrong. His handshake lasted a beat too long, and when I finally pulled my hand away, there was a faint red mark on my palm, as if I'd been holding on to something rough for too long. I rubbed at it absent-mindedly, trying to ignore the growing discomfort that had settled in my chest. The man stepped back without a word, the same calm expression still on his face, and I quickly rolled up the window, wanting to put as much distance between us as possible. As I drove off, I kept glancing at my rearview mirror, expecting to see him watching me, but he was gone, already vanished back into the dim light of the station. The encounter had left me rattled in a way I couldn't fully explain. My hand still tingled where his cold skin had touched mine, and the red mark didn't fade as quickly as I hoped it would. The further I drove, the worse I felt. It wasn't just fatigue anymore. My head felt heavy, and my thoughts became sluggish, like something was pressing down on my mind. I had to focus hard just to stay on the road, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than usual. Every few miles, I found myself glancing at my palm again, but the mark remained, a faint reminder of the encounter I couldn't quite shake. By the time I reached my destination, the mark had faded, but the uneasy feeling lingered. It was a subtle sensation, like something was off inside me, a disturbance I couldn't pinpoint but knew was there. In the following days, I tried to forget about it, telling myself it was just a weird, harmless interaction with a stranger. But every now and then, when I least expected it, I'd catch myself looking at my hand, rubbing at the spot where his grip had left that faint red imprint. It was gone, physically, but somehow the memory of it stayed, as if something from that moment had lingered. I still think about that handshake every time I pull into a gas station on an empty stretch of road. I never stop at night anymore, and I definitely don't make eye contact with strangers. I had been running late all day, so by the time I finally made it to the grocery store, the parking lot was mostly empty except for a few cars scattered around. It was late enough that the usual hum of activity had died down, leaving a strange quiet over the lot. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly as I parked in a far corner, away from the main entrance. The closer spots were already taken, but I didn't mind. I just wanted to get in and out. I rushed through my shopping, barely paying attention to anything but the items on my list. When I came back outside, the lot felt emptier than before. The fluorescent lighting cast long, harsh shadows, making everything look sharper than it should have. As I started loading my bags into the trunk, I caught sight of a figure standing at the edge of my vision. He was near the exit, just standing there. At first, I didn't think anything of it. People wait in parking lots for all kinds of reasons. Waiting for a ride, having a cigarette, maybe just killing time. But something felt off. It wasn't the way he stood exactly. It was the fact that he hadn't moved since I noticed him. There was no fidgeting, no shifting weight from one foot to the other like most people do when they're standing around. His posture was unnaturally still, as though he had no reason to be anywhere else. I tried to ignore it, focusing on packing my groceries, but I could feel his presence lingering at the back of my mind. I glanced back, more deliberately this time, and saw that he had moved closer. Not much, but enough for me to notice. His face was hard to make out under the dim lights, but his figure became clearer. He was average height, average build, dressed in nondescript clothes. Nothing about him was overtly alarming, but that was the problem. He was too neutral. I finished loading my groceries, my hands working faster now, the urgency starting to crawl into my chest. I didn't want to make it obvious that I had noticed him, but it was impossible to pretend anymore. He was watching me, standing a few feet closer now, still not doing anything. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe he was just lost, or waiting for someone, or maybe he needed help. But as these thoughts crossed my mind, another one, darker and sharper, pushed them aside. Something wasn't right here. I could feel it under my skin. I reached for the trunk, slammed it shut, and turned toward the driver's side. In my peripheral vision, I saw him move again, closer this time. A few steps closer, but still not running, still not trying to appear rushed. His presence felt heavier now, like he was filling the empty space between us without saying a word. My heart raced, and my keys nearly slipped from my fingers as I fumbled to unlock the car door. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I refused to look directly at him again. As I slid into the driver's seat, I locked the doors in one quick motion, my breath catching in my throat as I did. For a moment I sat there, staring straight ahead, afraid to look in the mirrors. I didn't want to see him, but I had to know. I checked the rearview mirror and saw him standing in the exact spot where I had last seen him, close enough now that I could make out his face, though I wished I couldn't. He had this expression, blank, almost curious, as though he was waiting for something. A strange, detached smile formed on his lips, one that didn't match the situation at all. It was a smile that should have been reassuring, but instead it made my skin crawl. My hand trembled as I shifted the car into gear. As I pulled out of the parking spot, he didn't flinch, didn't try to stop me. He just watched as I drove away, that unsettling smile never leaving his face. The further I got, the smaller he became in the mirror, until finally he was swallowed up by the dim light and distance. I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been waiting for me specifically, that his appearance wasn't some random coincidence. Even after I got home, after I double-checked the locks on my doors and windows, I couldn't stop thinking about him, the way he just stood there silently, as if he knew something I didn't. A few days later, I returned to the same grocery store, but this time I made sure to park closer to the entrance. As I grabbed my bags and headed inside, I couldn't resist looking toward the far end of the lot. And there he was, standing in the same spot, watching again. Only this time he was already smiling.